Welcome to the Snotrac Snotalk for March 2021. Before we get started, I'd like people to get a sense of who has joined us today. So I'm going to put up a quick poll on the screen, and then in a bit, I'm going to share the results at the end. So I'm going to launch it. Should be up on your screen. And for the second question, feel free to mark as many as are applicable for you. There's two kind of parts to it. One part being what you work on, the other part, what kind of entity you work for. So the mission of the Snohomish County Transportation Coalition, or Snotrac for short, is to connect people and communities in Snohomish County and beyond with safe, equitable, and accessible transportation. Snotrac envisions that by 2050, all people in Snohomish County, no matter their abilities or backgrounds, are able to easily access social, health, and economic services with a well-coordinated network of transportation services connecting all communities throughout the region. The Snotrac Speaker Series aims to bring new ideas to public officials, transportation, and human service professionals, and the residents of Snohomish County. Today's Snow Talk is co-hosted by the Everett Station District Alliance. The Alliance is a nonprofit organization working to build a prosperous, equitable, and sustainable community around the current Everett Transit Station, which is also the northern terminus of the future Link extension. We are honored to have Thatcher Imboden of Sound Transit, who will present the agency's strategies for supporting affordable housing and transit-oriented development. This work is critically important for Snohomish County's future. Our county's population is projected to increase by more than 400,000 people over the next 30 years. At the same time, Sound Transit is extending its high-capacity transit systems of Link Light Rail and Stride Bus Rapid Transit across the region, an investment of more than $50 billion. That's why the region's plan calls for 65% of population growth to live and 75% of employment growth to work within a walking distance of high-capacity transit. By having people living and working within walking distance to transit, the stresses of the rest of our transportation systems will be reduced. In addition, we will have the opportunity to create more affordable, equitable, and sustainable communities. This is why I'm excited to have Thatcher here today from Sound Transit. Before I hand it over to him, let's take a quick look at the poll results. So I will end the polling, share the results. So you should see, you will, if you want to see all the results for yourself, you will have to scroll down on the pop-up there. Most people are from kind of central Snohomish County, Marysville to Mill Creek. And that is our big area. And I guess I didn't put Everett here. So I'm guessing, I meant to put Everett in as its own thing, but I'm guessing that's central Snohomish County for folks where most people are at. Or maybe that one other might be there as well. The second, most people are working within roadway and right-of-way planning, as well as land use planning, and representing public agencies with a smattering of nonprofit organizations. So that's kind of a sense of who is here today. And with that, Thatcher, you can take it away and share your screen.
Thank you, Brock. Let's see if I can do this as we did in practice. Here we go. So as was mentioned, Sound Transit, I'm going to talk a little bit actually today about kind of the later phase of transit-oriented development work that Sound Transit does. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what is TOD at Sound Transit and kind of the work that we do, but I really want to focus on kind of why, if transit is really a way to get from one place to another, and really we're in the business of serving places and people who are going to those places or live in those places or work or visit. And what the TOD policy really does is really think about how are we using and how are we helping facilitate with our local jurisdictional partners and communities how those places are going to be shaped over the long term. And so what we're going to talk about transit-oriented development, focus less about the transit planning process and more about kind of redevelopment opportunities that Sound Transit has, because that's where a lot of our work is. So more on that in a few minutes. So Sound Transit has an equitable TOD policy that was adopted in 2018. Its goals are really focusing on making sure that the investment in transit is being well utilized by growing ridership, supporting local and regional growth plans, really engaging our communities in an equitable manner throughout the process of both transit planning, but also about when we have, say, redevelopment opportunities on surplus property, really making sure that we are working with communities to really define what is it that we're trying to achieve as goals for that property. Additionally, looking at how do we better integrate transit-oriented development, redevelopment, things of that sort into the transit planning process itself. It's not just a piece of transit, it's going to actually shape the communities for the long term and better either connect to existing communities and shape how those communities grow. Additionally, when Sound Transit has surplus property, really trying to focus on creating housing, especially affordable housing. And then lastly, encouraging safe and easy access to transit. There's kind of three major focuses or phases of work. There's station planning, and so that's really when we're building or planning our transit network. Where is the station going, and how is it supporting or fitting into existing stations or the future station areas? Then exploring opportunities for transit-oriented development, kind of higher intensity redevelopment opportunities. Sometimes looking at whether or not there's opportunities to literally pair transit infrastructure with development opportunities together, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. And lastly, when we have a project that is identified that could be built on Sound Transit land, really going through a process to figure out what is it that we're building and then implementing that. So where are there TOD opportunities? This kind of concept plan really shows that much of the land in station areas is owned by people other than Sound Transit, and that's what we would call community TOD. Those are opportunities for either existing development that supports transit ridership and walkable communities, or it's future development that could support those kinds of communities. That's generally within a 10 to 15-minute walk or about a half mile from stations. Additionally, Sound Transit, to build our transit, oftentimes, especially with rail, whether that's commuter rail or light rail, but more often the light rail, we need to buy land to build the actual infrastructure. And so there's kind of two types of land that we typically buy. That would be land that we need for the actual facility itself. That might be guideway. And sometimes with that, we're going to maybe bifurcate or kind of cut a property in half and need to take down the front part of a building. And so oftentimes in those cases, we're buying the whole property because having half a house is not very useful to anyone. And so that's where we may have, say, extra property at the end of the day. Additionally, we have needs to build, to have extra space to build our stations or kind of construction footprint areas. That's typically most substantial at actual stations, because the stations are both guideway and some sort of station facility. And those tend to take the longest to build and have the most area that it needs. And so over time, we've really tried to be smart about what is it that we're buying, so that we're not just looking at, okay, well, this works for construction, but what's our exit strategy at the end of the day? Because there's a lot of different ways in which you can lay out your construction area. And I do want to just mention here that Sound Transit only can buy property for a transit purpose. And so that's, to buy or to build or operate our transit. And so we're not buying property specifically for TOD, but we are thinking about the property we're buying and making sure that as a secondary consideration, how does things like our exit strategy and supporting local communities fit into that? The graphics here show two different examples of development projects that are near our stations, both at Mount Baker in Seattle. One being the one on the left is Art Space, which was built on surplus property that the agency had, and the second that Mercy Housing built was a couple blocks away from the station on privately owned property. Additionally, there are different types of what we would call agency TOD. There's kind of adjacent development, which is next to our facilities. Sometimes that might be across the street from an actual station. Additionally, there's air rights development or building above our transit facilities, but still keeping them separate so that they aren't dependent on one another, which we call air rights development. And then the third is integrated development, where there's actually a physical relationship and interdependencies between the two structures. And there's an increasing level of complexity going from adjacent to air rights, and then from air rights to integrated. And so most of Sound Transit's kind of TOD opportunities have been in that kind of adjacent category because of its the ease of kind of getting there. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but it gets definitely harder when you try to integrate real estate development, which is really third-party driven development with a transit agency's desire to deliver transit infrastructure on time, on schedule, and on time, on budget, with all the components that we would expect through the scope. Additionally, some of you may have heard, but if not, I want to just walk you through that when ST3 was passed, a state statute was enacted or went into effect that really governed the agency's use of surplus property. That is basically that of our surplus property, those that are determined to be suitable for housing, that at least 80% of that suitable property be first offered to these qualified entities to build affordable housing. And the state defined a qualified entity as a local government, a housing authority, or a nonprofit developer. And it went on to say that should Sound Transit transfer property to one of those entities for affordable housing, then at least 80% of the housing created on that property be affordable to those earning no greater than 80% of AMI, or area median income. And it also went on to say that should those factors be met, or criteria be met, then Sound Transit has the ability to get less than fair market value for property, including no-cost transfers. Up until then, Sound Transit did not have that option. We must have gotten fair market value for property, assuming a market rate use. And I should mention that that statute's often referred to as the 80-80-80 statute. So to date, we have about 2,100 housing units that are either built or in the process of being built on our property, that are our agency property. This is not including what we call community TOD or development that's happening near our stations, but rather just on Sound Transit property. That includes properties that are either currently already built, under construction, been awarded to our development partners, or that we're currently negotiating. It does not include pipelines of projects that we're planning, but have not yet identified a potential developer for. Those 2,100 units represent over $1 billion of public and private investment into those projects, and in many cases are providing some revenue back to the agency. Much of that revenue is coming from market rate projects or from projects that have occurred prior to that state statute going into effect. And of the 2,100 units, about 1,500 of those units, or more than 1,500 of those units, are considered affordable housing, and about 1,300 of those affordable housing units are considered long-term affordable housing, generally in that kind of 35 to 50-year time horizon. Since the statute went into effect, we have transferred over 80% of the properties first to qualified entities. Offered them to qualified entities. That's about 86%. And of the properties that have already been transferred and already in possession of the qualified entities, 100% of the units are being affordable to those earning less than 80% of area median income. And in fact, about half of them are at 60% of area median income, and the other half split between those serving no greater than 30% and the other about 50% of area median income. In terms of, and part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this today and what Brock and I were talking about is really kind of the end game, right? There's a lot of planning going on and starting around Everett Link extension, but I think you can often get kind of focused on the planning process and every step of the process, which is really important. But I think we wanted to provide some insights into kind of what is it looking like for the projects that are, either the properties that we had through the Sound Move, which are primarily in Seattle, and then ST2, where we're starting to see development opportunities along, Linwood Link extension or East Link, and with Federal Way Link extension. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what does it look like in these phases, because I think that will help provide insights as you start going into the planning phases for Everett. So in 2020, we actually, despite COVID, did have a project that opened in Capitol Hill. we have a multi-phase project. The first phase of the project opened, which is 110 units of long-term affordable housing. It's called Station House at Capitol Hill Housing, which is now known as Community Roots Housing, opened in March of 2020. Additionally, we had two projects break ground in 2020 despite COVID. First at Roosevelt with the Cedar Crossing project, that is a partnership between two nonprofit developers, Bellwether Housing and Mercy Housing Northwest, that are building over 250 units of long-term affordable housing. Additionally, they have a daycare and some retail space in that building right next to the Roosevelt Station. That project's going to open in 2020. Actually, it should be 2022. I apologize, there's the typo on that slide. About 9 months after the station will open later this year. The second project was over 360 units of affordable housing that is a partnership between Bellwether Housing and Plymouth Housing, and is actually a pretty innovative project because it partners both units that are serving the very low income at kind of 30% and below with wraparound services, as well as kind of more workforce housing of the 50 and 60% of area median income. Both those projects were the first projects that Sound Transit has done that are below fair market value. Roosevelt was a steep discount, and First Hill was a no-cost transfer. We also have began negotiations at our Operations and Maintenance Facility East, which is in the Bellred area, next to the Spring District 120th station in Bellevue, and which is a multi-phase, mixed-use, mixed-income project of about 6 buildings that includes office, market-rate housing, and long-term affordable housing. Additionally, we have 12 small sites in Rainier Valley that we are transferring to the City of Seattle for affordable housing that used a pretty innovative FTA approval process that is allowing us to do no-cost transfer there for long-term affordable home ownership, which is a difficult product to move forward. And then lastly, we had our board approve kind of our approach at our Angle Lake Station for 2 redevelopments that we're looking to do there. We also, on the planning side, have been doing work on the West Seattle Ballard project, Tacoma Dome Link extension, where we're really looking at where are the development opportunities where for different station alignments, but also starting to really look at where could there be joint development or opportunities to kind of really develop TOD at the same time that we're building some of the infrastructure, potentially even integrating that. And so that includes some of our BRT projects. The example here is in Kenmore, that could be potential partnership between King County Metro, who owns the land, and adjacent property owner, and Sound Transit. Looking forward at agency TOD in 2021, the rest of our projects at Capitol Hill, there's 3 buildings that will be opening. Actually, they all have certificate of occupancy now. Those are the 3 market rate buildings, and they include about 21% of the units affordable through the city's multifamily tax exemption program. Additionally, we have a project that we sold a very small property to an adjacent property owner who's redeveloping their property as market rate housing. And again, there's affordable housing being provided through the city's tax exemption program. Additionally, we're expecting to have about 125 units of long-term affordable housing serving the LGBTQ senior populations in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. That was a very complicated land transfer with Seattle Central College, Capitol Hill Housing, now Common Roots Housing, and Sound Transit and the State Board of Education, that looking at how we could potentially trade assets that the college owned with an asset that we own next to our station. And so we've figured out how to support affordable housing and support kind of the orderly development of a property that's adjacent to a college's property on the west side of Broadway up there. Additionally, we're going through the partnering process. We'll be issuing a request for proposals at our Angle Lake site in the city of SeaTac momentarily, and then bringing back the terms from our Bellevue transaction I mentioned earlier. Additionally, we are actively planning our sites in Federal Way at the transit center there, at Kent Des Moines Station in Kent, the Overlook Village Station in Redmond, Linwood City Center, as well as a couple sites in the city of Seattle. And I think this is really exciting in part because we've been tracking these development opportunities for some time. And I think the time is now over, starting in late 2020, and we really started working more with more significant efforts in these stations as they get ready for redevelopment, likely having construction that would start just after the stations open in 2024, generally speaking. And I just wanted to talk briefly, which is around the planning side, some of the work that has already been done on the West Seattle Ballard and Tacoma Dome. We expect to be publishing station co-planning work and joint development assessments, looking at where could there be opportunities, recognizing that the process has a long ways to go still on those projects. And again, continuing to look at what kind of partnering opportunities we have on the BRT sites. And I mentioned the BRT in part because Sound Transit doesn't buy as much property when we do a bus rapid transit project, in part because a lot of the stations are in the public right of way. But as a part of the BRT program, there is a parking component that was assumed to be on outside of the right of way. And so we're looking at how could we potentially leverage investments in parking to see if we can get something more than just parking. And so that's an ongoing area that our practice continues to work with other partners within the agency to see how can we better leverage parking investments for other community benefits. Yeah, I want to kind of end on two slides. One's focusing kind of on the opportunities, and the second really kind of some of the challenges and risks, because I think the sooner that people start thinking about it, the easier it is for us to realize the, I think, visions that communities have for station areas, especially as it relates to where there might be, say, public land that could be redeveloped to support those visions. One is, our biggest opportunity areas has been really focusing on multi-agency partnerships that look at pairing Sound Transit land, oftentimes discounted, with financial resources. So that has looked like the city of Seattle bringing affordable housing construction and permanent financing dollars paired up with Sound Transit discounted land. We've also done that with Arch on the east side, as well as King County. We continue to look at what does partnerships look like. It seems that they have been a pretty positive way to try to reduce project risk, increase the speed of which projects can move, and potentially reduce per unit costs in these TODs, recognizing that in general TODs tend to be a little bit more expensive than if you were building on say, a greenfield site. Additionally, some of our larger TOD opportunities are actually in areas that are outside of the city of Seattle. I mentioned Federal Way and Kent are two sites in particular where we have larger sites that allow us to try to go after potentially different uses or mixed income, mixed use projects that can be horizontally separated. The more things that you ask one individual building to do, the harder it gets. Larger sites allow you to go after multiple goals and try to split up different responsibilities so that you're not overwhelming projects. Additionally, we are trying to create a more predictable pipeline to assist our communities, our developers, and jurisdictional partners around what does our development pipeline look like so we can plan our resources together. Additionally, we're really looking at trying to expand the work that we do with community-based organizations and BIPOC-led entities, whether those are developers or nonprofits, as I think there's continued to be more focus on trying to make sure that public land is being used for public benefit, and how do we make sure that those benefits are being provided to groups that have traditionally been excluded from a lot of these processes. Additionally, we are looking at potential joint development opportunities to deliver parking or other station facilities in certain station areas that are more likely and conducive to being able to deliver those. And we are looking at what kind of long-term value capture can exist from integrated joint developments, especially from market rate projects, so that we can try to assist our capital expansion program. As it relates to challenges and risks, and this is where I will kind of end after the slide, is that obviously the recession and future recessions always have impacts on real estate and on capital projects. We're still trying to understand what impacts we're going to see. Sound Transit is going through a realignment process, and I think next month you'll be hearing more about Sound Transit and Everett Link extension in context to that. So I won't go into that here today, but just want to flag that recession always creates challenges and risks for projects. Additionally, as everyone is likely aware, there's a substantial oversubscription of affordable housing funding resources, whether that's at the local level or at the state level. That creates certainly challenges to our pipeline that has a significant amount of affordable housing being brought on, and a lot of our transit projects are getting delivered at the same time, and many communities are going to want to see affordable housing developments occur as quickly as possible. And so when you have multiple affordable housing projects that are all trying to start at the same year, you're going to have a major challenge there for us to work through. Additionally, there's internal and external capacity challenges that we have to continue to work through to bring on projects. As I mentioned with ST2, we have a lot of projects that are being, and then with ST3, with the BRT program, a lot of projects that are going to be delivered between 2023 and 2025, at least those are the current schedules. And as a result, there's a lot of prioritization that needs to occur to figure out how and where we're spending our time. Certainly, I mentioned earlier, finding balance between project goals and resources. Oftentimes we look at, I think communities are and government agencies are trying to maximize policy goals and other goals, and they all take resources. And so, trying to make sure that we are not setting up projects to not be able to deliver on all the goals, while recognizing that sometimes you might want to actually sit on property so that you could wait for resources to be aligned or for projects to be more feasible. And so trying to find that right balance between being overly pragmatic versus overly vision focused is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. Aligning, as we talked about earlier, there's different typologies. Joint development as it relates to integrating projects also means that you have to align transit project scope, schedule, and budget with the market readiness and whether or not developers can actually deliver a project in the same time horizon and with the same goals that we have. Certainly to be able to achieve some of these joint development opportunities, in particular, trying to get alignment between the planning process and the transit project milestones that we need to hit so that we have enough time to go out and find a development partner and not create a situation where we miss an opportunity is something that we're working on and continue to refine. And then certainly the funding of non-housing spaces and affordable housing projects is a continued problem, I think, in the affordable housing world. And, with TODs in particular, there's been a long, I think, policy goals around trying to have mixed-use buildings. And the affordable housing financing tools that exist are really not conducive to trying to make that work. There are ways to do it, but it is hard. And I think that certainly we've seen it. Say on a market rate project, a market rate developer might be willing to say use the retail space as a loss loser to be able to have an amenity for spaces in the apartments or office space on the upper floors. But with affordable housing, you're not going to get a cost premium because you have a loss-losing retailer in the ground floor. So those are the kinds of issues that I think some of our projects have run into, and we're going to continue to have to navigate and figure out how to problem solve. And then certainly there's been some, I think, as we get into areas that station areas that were maybe built under kind of post-World War II, very car-oriented spaces, there's often a lot of infrastructure that's needed to kind of evolve that place into being more supportive to people who are walking, biking, rolling, or otherwise getting to the sites, to our stations. And the question is, how is that infrastructure getting developed? Some jurisdictions use more developer-based infrastructure development, and that means that there is a certain amount of public benefit is being driven by the developers. And so I think as we look at how do those districts get redeveloped, just recognizing how much burden we put on projects could take away from other public benefits that you try to get. And so I think that, certainly as we talk about affordable housing, we have to make sure that we are not asking affordable housing developers to also solve issues that are beyond maybe just providing the housing. Those are some of the things that we deal with, whether that's streetscape improvements, district stormwater, new streets and roads, very expansive plazas, things of that sort. And then lastly, some of the sites are of the size where there might be a phased project. And so sometimes those phased projects have upfront infrastructure that needs to be developed. And to the extent that affordable housing goes first, The question is, how do you fund the second phase, the later phases, especially if those phases are future affordable housing or even market rate housing that might not be in a position to make a pre-commitment to fund that. So those are some of the issues that our program are wrestling with. Certainly, it's not we're not alone in wrestling with them, but I think that kind of sharing them here today gives you an insight into kind of when we get further into the Everett Link process and we start actually knowing we may have some specific agency TOD opportunities. These are some of the both opportunities and challenges that we may have to plan through, resource plan, and engage on. So that's my presentation for today, and I will hand it back to you, Brock, for next steps.
Fantastic, Thatcher. Great presentation. This is the second time I got to see it. I got to see it last week as well. So it's really great. I'm going to open it up to questions. I have a couple of questions written down, but you're so thorough, Thatcher. So there's a lot of content, maybe some of it new for folks in the meeting. So I imagine there are questions. If you would like to ask, please flip on your video so we can call on you, or just unmute yourself to do it. If you don't want to flip on your camera to indicate, just raise your hand using the share reaction feature for them. Well, I will try to kick it off here. One question that I'm curious about, and I know we're not covered. We are definitely, just to reiterate for those of you who may have joined after the intros or I post in the chat, we're not covering the Everett Link extension planning process or realignment. But I am curious around, as the agency thinks about alignments generally across the entire region, how does TOD affect the decision-making? The goal of selecting sites, selecting alignments, where the station is going to go, how does that help influence? How does the TOD opportunities influence the ultimate decisions around alignment?
The TOD is one set of factors that gets considered. I mean, I think there's a number of different phases in the transit planning process. There's, looking at different alignment choices, right? This is kind of looking at guideway and stations, and where are you shifting them a little bit over this way, a block or two, or are they going a little bit more this direction? And as a part of that, we typically would look at things like development propensity analysis, kind of saying like, is one going to be more supportive of future development, or have more land available for development and that's conducive for development than others? We look at existing populations and who's being served, and so in some cases you're already going into transit supportive locations, and so I don't want to make it seem like TOD is and the goals of our program is just around redevelopment, because it's not. And I think as a result, we at the early phases, it's more about how do different station and guideway alignments affect kind of both access and some of these issues that are kind of intertwined with TOD. Is it going to be more people who are going to live near it and be able to walk to the station versus people who are going to now have to cross a freeway and or there's a rail line and all sorts of that kind of stuff. I think secondly, we start looking at when you actually start laying out station options, you start thinking about, well, how are people actually going to get to the station? Where are they start, there's usually workshopping processes with local stakeholders and government, really starting to look at access issues. Where is the bus facilities, transfer facilities going to go? But also looking at like the likely footprints that Sound Transit would need for different options. And those footprints are things like, what kind of off-street bus facilities are we going to need? Is there a park and ride component? Is there, what does the station profile look like in the park, the passenger drop-off and pickup zones? And what we want to do is also recognize that to do that, you can overlay the existing property lines, right? That gives you kind of an idea of what would you likely have to acquire to do that, and that gives you an idea about like what we don't want to have happen, this is one of the things we learned in the past, is Sound Transit going in, just planning our infrastructure, not really thinking about the stuff around. You know, it's like, well, here's the end of the property line. Now here's a 20-foot empty grass section that will never get redeveloped and will sit here as a fenced property for the rest of time. Like, we need to think about how that property is going to be reused and potentially redeveloped, or is there a way that you lay out your facility so that you're not leaving awkward land sizes? So that's part of the planning process too. And we also then start looking at, say, if it's a surface parking lot, you know, is there a way that this could potentially be, you know, could you get a joint development opportunity? So we might look at, there's what you would call the residual value of the land. So, you know, if the land is worth this and we end up buying all of it for a parking lot, if we were to say, we're going to spend X millions of dollars on building a parking lot, and here's our land, and here's how much parking we need, would somebody be able to deliver you something different? So could they deliver you that parking? Maybe it's shared. We still are trying to figure out, you know, what does shared parking look like for the agency? But you're looking at, are there development opportunities that integrate with your actual transit facilities, and is it financially feasible? And if it's not on its own, how would you resource that? So those are some of the types of work that we would do. And then later, you know, when we start saying, okay, well, we need construction space, the construction management team in the agency would say, okay, we need X acres. Here are different alignments of what we need from a construction perspective. Then we would look at it and say, okay, well, of these ones, here's the better one. Here are the different pros and cons from a TOD perspective. And there's other overlays that the agency uses, but it's an opportunity for us to think about how TOD and redevelopment or existing uses kind of factor into Sound Transit's impact in the community.
Great. Before I ask my next question, just pause in case somebody else wants to ask a question here. Well, yes, it would be great if people shared the organization that they're with in the chat. I just noticed Christine did that. That's great. Question for you, Thatcher. There's now with 2,100 units either built or in the pipeline at this point, there's been a number of relationships and partnerships built. What have been some of the key elements of success that you've seen with agency, as the agency calls it, agency TOD of property that is owned by the agency that's eventually converted into transit-oriented development? What are some of the factors?
Yeah, I think there's a number. I mean, I'd say on the early side of kind of the process, you know, engaging early with jurisdictions around what is the long-term vision, and with communities around the long-term vision for a station area. I think that, you know, that's also applicable to the transit planning process period, which is like, what are you trying to do here? And then really starting to engage early enough around things like what kind of say comp plan updates you might want to do around the zoning, you know, parking requirements, all of the kinds of kind of planning aspects, regulatory aspects, and then infrastructure planning, because I think Sound Transit is going to certainly have, especially with the light rail, you know, a significant amount of infrastructure that we're going to be building and impacting, but there's infrastructure that other agencies often have to do as well, right? If they're planning for growth, oftentimes we're going to see cities start thinking about, say, how are they going to have individual developers deal with stormwater? Does the city want to lead with figuring out a district stormwater solution so that everybody's not trying to deal with it on their own individual properties? If that's the case, then you have to figure out where are you putting it and how are you financing it. Additionally, you know, a lot of these stations, especially in areas outside the established core, you're talking about new street systems. And so Sound Transit, depending on what we design and like if we're building park and ride facilities, you know, we might build some of that, but we're probably not building all of it. And so the question is, to what degree is the city planning for where those new streets should go? And then who is going to build them? Is that going to be something that the city wants to take on, or they're going to have developer provided infrastructure? And trying to get ahead of that conversation before they have land use applications coming in by, developers who are starting to plan their process. So I think the more that there's vision on the front end, especially vision that has been tested to some degree to kind of start airing what some of the issues might be and the trade-offs that need to be made, that's always helpful. The city of Redmond, as an example, did a fair amount of planning around, I think, both from a zoning perspective and planning, land use planning, but also around things like they did decide to do district stormwater. We delivered some of that district infrastructure, and they're taking on getting the other district infrastructure invested or taken care of. They also came up with a kind of a plan for the transportation system, say in like Overlake Village station area, that provided some design guidelines and kind of road network designations that I think really helped some of the conversations for like us when we get to an agency TUD. It's like, okay, well, where do we have to engage the jurisdiction in the community around where things like parking access or trash services need to be, because that will have an impact on the community. And it's like, well, the street designations already contemplated that. Here's where a good starting place for the conversation. And then I would say that certainly if to the extent that you're looking beyond the market to deliver you things, I think you start talking about resourcing, right? Sound Transit has land. Our board has to decide whether or not it's going to discount property, but land costs for affordable housing, it's 5 to 10% of the costs. And even if you give someone free land in an urban environment, they're not going to be able to deliver unsubsidized long-term affordable housing. We haven't seen that yet. So therefore, you're talking about, well, how are you resourcing it? And certainly local resources have played a very important role there. We've certainly partnered with the city of Seattle. They've brought that 250 unit project I mentioned, they brought $15 million to the table. We discounted the property from about 18 million down to just over $6 million. At the time, we were running underneath federal guidelines that we couldn't really go any lower than that. And then I would say, with King County, they've brought resources to the table. They brought their TOD bond program to bring $10 million to our property in Bellred, and the Arch brought $4 million from the east side. So we had $14 million of public money supporting what was two free pieces of land, one of them from the city of Bellevue, one of them from Sound Transit, all in one RFP. And so we've been partnering. We've done partnerships where the cities have brought resources after the fact. So we've gone out, find a developer, then the developers, they're scrappy, they can get stuff done. They'll go out and find the money and then figure it out. But to the extent that we can pre-align resources and make sure that the cities feel like their goals are being reflected in the projects that we're finding, it's an opportunity to make sure that the cities, if they're the ones bringing the resources, whoever's bringing the resources, feel like Sound Transit and them are collectively coming up with goals, going out together, evaluating proposals together so that we feel like we're both getting the best overall value, and then going through the process. We have, in some cases, done partnerships with the city of Bellevue when we did our OMF, our operations and maintenance facility in the Bellred area. We did go ahead and entitle the TOD site. So it was not to a permitting level, but we took it to a certain amount of entitlements to get approvals for 6 buildings and over 1 million square feet of development as a part of our permitting of our transit facility. There were some benefits there, but it's not always the right tool in all circumstances, because it does kind of create expectations that the project you entitle is the project that the development community would develop, when you recognize that we are a transit agency. We are trying to do our best and trying to come up with what we think are market reasonable developments, but we aren't the one to actually execute it. And so I think there's always a balancing act there too.
It sounds like a lot of these partnerships are directly between public agencies, between your agency and between a city or a county, in terms of figuring out the details of a project. On the ground, from the city perspective, is that being led by the city, or is there a community partner, nonprofit, housing provider, or somebody else who's shaping that vision and pushing for it? And do you work with them, or do you end up working with the public agency primarily as you go through the process?
I think it's been both. I think certainly our policy is encouraging and really pushing us towards an equitable engagement strategy, and the agency both on as a whole is is kind of come up with an equitable engagement strategy, and then our program has an equitable engagement approach. And so we are looking to work with community-based organizations to really inform the vision. And I think there is a really hard balancing act of trying to figure out how do you want to make sure you're using people's time wisely. You're trying to figure out, how do you move on that kind of progression of empowering people more to have more influence over the outcomes, but recognizing that there is a system of resources. And I think that we continue to try to figure out how to evolve. We have partnered, say, with in the city of Seattle and in Rainier Valley. We partner with Puget Sound Sage that helped advise us and support our community engagement efforts around our home ownership program. And they ended up, we use them as an intermediary to be able to get to community-based organizations. So we basically were able to go and meet with community-based organizations and support them financially to host us for meetings and provide childcare and meet them where they want to be met and try to have meaningful engagement.
Well, so with that project, for example, Homesite, I believe, was the big partner from a nonprofit perspective, or from a land trust perspective, or who's the entity who will end up owning the property and helping to manage it?
So in that circumstance, we're transferring the properties to the city of Seattle, and the city of Seattle is bringing $10 million to the table, and they will be issuing RFPs to find developers. But before they do that, they're going to build off the existing engagement. They've hired Puget Sound Sage and Grounded Solutions Network to really try to work through how do we achieve as many community benefits through this process as possible. And I think land trusts is certainly a major component of trying to provide long-term affordability, and certainly Homesite and others have been involved in the process thus far, but no one has been awarded development rights.
Well, let's see if anybody in the chat has a question again. I know there's a number of people on the line who are going to be working on these issues. I'm looking at Fred Safstrom of Housing Hope, and Becky McCrary of the city of Everett, doing the housing strategy for the city. So if anybody feels has some questions, now would be a good time. What do you think is it? Given is there a next step with Sound Transit's policies? Is there a next thing that you're looking to do with transit-oriented development that's not currently, in the programming, but something that the agency is looking to expand towards?
I think there's kind of two areas. One is the kind of integrated joint development, air rights development. I think that it is hard to get that done, especially in areas that don't have extremely strong real estate markets. And it does require a certain amount of both planning, it touches like the environmental process, it touches the contracting process for the transit component, it touches certainly real estate law and real estate market components. We're trying to figure out how do you develop a process that actually can result in integrated development or air rights development. And so that is one area that we've been working towards, and we'll probably continue to do a lot of work in 2021. Additionally, I think that we have been pretty, since ST3 was passed and that statute went into effect, we've really been trying to, I think there's a saying, it's like, you've seen one TOD, you've seen one TOD. I know everybody uses that saying, but like, they're all unique, they're all hard, you learn something every time. And we're trying to figure out how do we provide, as I mentioned, better clarity about our pipeline. And so we have been doing a property portfolio analysis of about 25 of our, most, our upcoming properties that we felt that we could evaluate, coming up with a framework to kind of evaluate how do we prioritize properties, looking at kind of a needs and opportunities analysis for them, and then kind of coming up with a process to talk about our pipeline, because it's an enormous pipeline when you start looking at both what's in the existing kind of, we expect these are going to be surplus at the end of the day, and then you start talking about what could be out of the ST3 projects. It's a huge number, and if we don't start talking about that soon, we may be catching some of our jurisdictional partners and off guard and other stakeholders. So I would expect in 2021 you'll hear more from us and we'll start engaging our stakeholders around that. But we're right now trying to make sure we have facts before we get too far ahead of ourselves.
Well, I see Fred has flipped on his screen, so we have a question from Fred, I'm guessing.
Okay, thanks for the presentation here. This is really helpful. I just want to see if I'm gathering this differentiation right. It sounds like you have increased authority now for contributing land for transit-oriented development that you didn't have earlier on. Is there still a decision-making process though between whether you are contributing a property or whether you are discounting a property or some portion of its value? And if that's still a decision-making process, what are the factors that go into that on whether you might decide to contribute to property and whole to a project?
It's a great question, Fred. Thank you. Right now, the existing policy is that the board is the only one who can make the decision of whether or not they're going to discount the property. So it is a board action. Secondly, our process to date has been going through an engagement process to figure out what is it that we're trying to get as goals, and then we need to figure out whether or not a discount is necessary to achieve the goals. So I think that the statute says that we can discount property for if a project includes 80% of the units or more at 80% of a area median income or below. But some of those projects in some cases may not actually need much, if any, of a discount if you were having 20% of the units be market rate. There's some issues there about there's not really a market for that kind of product. But that aside, I think that we need to go through kind of a but-for test to show that without discounting, it's not possible. And then there's a component to the evaluation that's really looking at federal rules and regs. We often have purchased property with federal funding, and with federal funding means that they actually have an interest in the property that has to be addressed if you are going to redevelop it as TOD or sell it. And so we have to, in the interest of time, I can't go down that rabbit hole today, but I will just say that that's extremely complicated. We have a lot of different tools, but it's not it's not an easy. We've been trying to figure out how can we easily communicate that, but we continue to work on trying to figure out how to communicate how we navigate federal rules and regs around discounting, because that's probably been one of the bigger challenges that we have to navigate.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Unless somebody has a burning question, just take a moment here. All right. I want to thank you, Thatcher, for this wonderful presentation on Sound Transit's TOD strategies. We do have a couple of presentations coming up in a month, so I just want to make sure that folks know about them. I will, let's see here, provide links to them in the chat and then share my screen just so we have that. So on Thursday, April 29th, is a presentation of the Convergence Study Final Report, which is a study being led by Housing Hope for exploring concepts for transit-oriented development at Everett Station. And then on April 30th, we have the next Snotalk, which is Sound Transit coming back and presenting on Everett Link and the realignment planning relating to the budget shortfall. And so you'll have that. There'll actually probably be a couple other opportunities, not through Snotrac, but through through the city of Everett and others for presentations from Sound Transit on that issue previous to April 30th. So we'll keep you up to date on that. So thank you everybody for joining. Just check the chat before I go. All right. I will hang on for a little bit after here, but I just want to thank everybody for joining and have a great day.